Yeah, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you for being GI map users or at least interested in the GI map and learning more about it. I am an employee of Diagnostic Solutions. I'm our clinical content and education manager. So I do a lot with our educational programming, and I also consult on this test. I see a lot of these tests. I have a very strong pulse on the industry. I have a very strong pulse on practitioners learning curve as they go through this test. So these sessions are really designed to be like FAQs come to life. So I'm going to take you through some introductory information today, some common FAQs in certain areas of the test. I think the plan, this is the first time we're doing this on the Rupa platform. I think the plan is to do these live classes monthly. As we go through this today, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A as Lexi stated, and we will review those and we will plan future coursework based on that feedback we receive in terms of what topics you want to hear more about. Today, we're going to just go through a brief intro to the GI map and the quantitative reporting using quantitative PCR. That's a really important aspect of reading and interpreting the test. And I feel like that's an area where a lot of people have confusion. We're going to do a quick page by page walkthrough, trying to familiarize yourself with the layout of the report. In my opinion, one of the big strengths of the GI map is its organization and its brevity. The fact that we give you this amount of clinical relevance and actionability in only 5 pages, to me, is really remarkable for a test like this. A lot of stool tests on the market can get quite cumbersome in terms of their report length, and you end up having to fish through data trying to determine what's actionable, what isn't actionable. So we're going to go through that. H. pylori is a huge feature of the GI map, and we get tons of questions on H. pylori. So I'm going to go through H. pylori in a little more detail and kind of highlight some of the FAQs and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of our level of understanding there. And then I'm going to introduce you to the 3 common dysbiosis patterns, the kind of buckets of dysbiosis that these GI maps tend to fall into. That's a really, really strong theme that we educate is on these individual dysbiosis patterns. And then I'm going to give you a quick review of the DSL educational resources that are available to you, in addition to everything Rupa offers for the test itself as well. And then, like I said, if there's anything I'm not covering today, we will do more of these in the future. So please drop your feedback and kind of your interest areas, thirst for more knowledge, and we'll take that into consideration for future program design. Okay, so I've worked with a lot of stool tests. Honestly, I've been niched in the gut for a good decade now. Been working with a lot of different gut tests. Why choose the GI map? What makes the GI map stand out? It's superior technology. So GI map it's a combination of microbial analysis, and then we also combine that with intestinal health proteins, which are critical. But for the microbial analysis, we're using quantitative PCR, a technical term, but essentially this is different than other PCR tests. This is not a 16S test. I hear that a lot in kind of the chatter. We are not 16S. We are quantitative PCR that offers a high degree of sensitivity and specificity for the targets we're analyzing on this test. We can find low abundant organisms, and for each organism we report, we are giving a absolute quantitative value. It's the readability. The test is only as good as its interpretation, and we know that. But I feel that practitioners are not fully understanding this aspect of quantitative reporting and the importance that gives, especially when you're trying to interpret the degree of magnitude of overgrowth. The test is designed with clinically relevant targets. So we're looking at pathogens, opportunists, commensals, viruses, yeast, obviously H. pylori, protozoa, and more. I guess if there's one thing, a con to this type of test and technology, is that the GI map is only finding what we're looking for. We are looking for specific targets, but those targets have been very well designed and identified for clinical relevance and actionability. And then, of course, the test also includes intestinal health chemistries, which I find critically important. I don't think you can do a proper assessment of gut health without comparing the microbial analysis to the intestinal health profile. So there's a lot of stool tests out there that don't include these intestinal health markers. in my opinion, that just doesn't really get the job done. And I'll speak to why here in a minute. But looking at inflammation, digestive health markers, immune function, zonulin, critical information, in my opinion. So we speak of the qPCR advantage. It's like finding a needle in the haystack, right? So most of, especially when we're looking at organisms that we're going to quote unquote treat, most of these organisms are very low abundant in the microbiome. They're not present at very high concentrations, and therefore it requires a very sensitive technology to find these organisms. It's like finding needles in a haystack. A lot of the other methodologies, and I think that when we're comparing stool tests, it's not apples to apples, right? You have to consider the pros and the cons and the advantages and the disadvantages to any tool that you're using in functional workup. But if you are looking at these low abundance targets, most of the more modern metagenomic sequencing style of stool tests just simply cannot see this low. So you're not going to be capturing those level pathogens and opportunists. Organisms like H. pylori are a good example of that. So that is the advantage of a tool like the GI map, is that we are largely picking up on these low abundant microbes and giving you the quantitative reporting of those. All right, let's do a quick overview of the test. Like I said before, I really think part of the strength of this test is its succinctity, the way it's organized. With any functional tool, there's going to be a learning curve. We know that. Everyone who's using functional testing should embrace that. But I like to think that the learning curve on the GI map is pretty quick. And that's because it's a pretty well organized report. And once you get it, the interpretation of these tools can take a matter of minutes. And that's very valuable if you are busy, like I think we all are. So, in short, page 1 of the GI map, these are your overt gut pathogens. These are organisms that are documented to be pathogenic, that tend to cause more of an acute gastroenteritis. There are some exceptions with that, like Giardia obviously can be a very chronic condition. I would say the vast majority of times you run a GI map, page 1 is going to be non-remarkable. Everything will be reported less than DL, below our detection limit. So that's expected. A lot of times we're just using this page as a rule in, rule out, and we quickly move on to page 2. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we're seeing these low level C. diffs, these E. coli pathogens. I actually have a consult today with a very high level of Giardia. I'm interested to learn a little more about that case. So obviously page 1 is essential, and all of these are actionable and usually need some sort of attention when we see them. Page 2 of the test includes our H. pylori profile, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, that's a very strong feature of the GI map. And again, we are using quantitative PCR to measure H. pylori. And then page 2 also includes our section of commensal keystone bacteria. So these are your commensal organisms. This is essentially your good guys in the gut. And we can get quite a bit of insight depending on the patterns that come out of the commensals. Are they trending more towards insufficiency? Are they trending more towards overgrowth? Um, and so that's part of our pattern assessment. Absolutely. I will say, obviously, like I mentioned, we're only looking at specific targets on the GI map. So this is a small slither of the microbiome. We are looking at the 2 largest phyla, Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes, and then the individual genus and species targets that we're assessing here are very, very, very clinically relevant, meaning they show up in literature all the time and they are fairly well documented. Page 3. So page 3 is the darling of the GI map. Page 3 is looking at your opportunistic microbes. Opportunistic microbes tend to grow when there is an opportunity to do, and that can be low abundance of commensals, that can be poor digestion, that can be hypochlorhydria, that can be low immune function. As we were discussing with the qPCR advantage, a lot of these organisms are very low abundant in the microbiome. So it takes a very sensitive technology to find a lot of them. And then we quantify them and we report them in an absolute value with an exponent. And reading that exponent is critical to interpreting this page, not just this page, any page on the GI map, really. Even in this example here, where we see Pseudomonas, this is an E6 overgrowth compared to an E4 reference range. That's a 2 order of magnitude overgrowth. That's highly significant. So I do feel like practitioners don't completely grasp this when they're reading it. The number to the right of the E is almost more important than the number to the left of the E when you are reading this report. And then page 3 also includes our fungi and yeast panel. Candida is probably what's on top of everybody's mind in terms of our yeast targets. And then we have some viral targets as well, CMV and EBV viral target on page 3. Page 4 includes our non-pathogenic protozoa and worms. So remember, we do have pathogenic parasites on page 1. This set is our classified, these organisms are not classified as pathogens. There's various utility in using these markers and always involves symptom assessment. We can see them sometimes in asymptomatic conditions, but we, of course, often see them when they're a root cause of chronic digestive health issues that haven't been uncovered for decades. We see this all the time. So that's a nice feature of the test. And then, of course, our intestinal health markers, which is a really nice collection of data in and of itself, looking at digestion, GI markers, immune response markers, inflammatory markers, and then zonulin, which is an add-on to the GI map. And then page 5 are the antibiotic resistance genes for H. pylori. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more specific to H. pylori. This, depending on your kind of credentials and your scope of practice, some clinicians may use this more so than others, but essentially in terms of antibiotic stewardship, we are measuring essentially different SNPs of the H. pylori genome. And if any of these specific gene targets that are known to confer antibiotic resistance are present, we report that, and it can help triage your decision making if you are going to use antibiotics in treatment. And then there are 3 add-on options for the GI map. Zonulin is an add-on, and then we have a cool fecal gluten protein marker that I feel like a lot of people don't know about. I haven't put that into the presentation today, but that's something we can review in future sessions if you'd like. This is essentially a direct assessment of gluten peptide in stool. So it can be a test to monitor patients' gluten-free compliance. And then we also have an add-on of universal antibiotic resistance genes. This is probably less common, less popular, only because, again, it depends on your credentials and scope of practice. Similar to the H. pylori antibiotic resistance, we do offer a panel of universal microbiome antibiotic resistance, again, that can be used in terms of kind of treatment planning and programming. All right, let's talk a little bit more about H. pylori. I feel obviously I do a lot of education for GI map on a lot of different platforms and channels. And regardless of the topic, I could be doing a topic on gluten and the questions will go back to H. pylori. So I just feel like there's a insurmountable amount of questions on this topic. So I figured I'd get that in front of you today. So again, H. pylori, huge feature of the GI map. And again, that speaks to our quantitative PCR advantage. So on the GI map, you're going to get essentially 3 buckets of data when it comes to H. pylori. Number 1, you're going to get the level detected. So this example we're looking at here, 1.16 e to the third, that is equivalent to 1,160 microorganisms per gram of stool. 1,100, essentially 1,160. Now, the reference range where for the GI map where we call H. pylori high is 1,000 or 1.0 e to the third. The lowest level you will ever see reported on a GI map is a 1.0 E2, which is equivalent to 100 microorganisms per gram of stool. And then you will see, so if you see any result between 100 and 1,000 at that E2 level, you will see H. pylori detected. You will see a number reported, but it will not be flagged high if it's below 1,000. And that's where we get a lot of our questions is in that kind of equivocal range. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. The second bucket of information you're getting are virulence factors. So we do run virulence factors as a reflex to reporting the quantitative amount of H. pylori, and these are reported as a positive or negative. Now, one thing I do want you guys to understand with virulence factors, it's not that common to see positive virulence factors. We have a nice table of the virulence factors in our GI map interpretive guide, which I'm going to talk about at the end. If you don't have a copy of that, you need to get one. You can download it. So you don't really need to commit these virulence factors to memory. But if you ever have a positive, you can refer to that table. Essentially, these are also like they're different genetic variants. They're like genetic SNPs of H. pylori that confer more virulence. So they're associated with more adverse clinical outcomes, things like duodenal ulcers and even gastric cancers. Not definitively diagnostic, but again, higher risk potential. Usually when there is a virulence factor present, that's going to prompt most providers to want to treat regardless of the level. One thing I do want you all to understand about virulence factors and the antibiotic resistance genes is that the result of H. pylori needs to be 500 or 5.0 E2 or greater in order for the lab to have enough DNA to process these. If the result is under 500, the virulence factors and the antibiotic resistance genes are going to be reported as NA. That does not mean they are negative. That means they were not run because the value was too low. And I hear this mistake made all the time. We just don't know. It could be a 2.63 E2 H. pylori with virulence factors. We don't know if the level is below 500. And same applies for the antibiotic resistance genes. So wanted to make that point. Yeah, you're getting a level, you're getting the virulence factors, and you're getting the antibiotic resistance. And H. pylori is a big deal. It's controversial. If you get 5 different practitioners in a room and ask for their opinion on this whole H. pylori story, you're probably going to get 5 different opinions, to be perfectly honest. But what we do know is that H. pylori can have a major influence on symptoms like upset stomach, gastritis, acid reflux, GERD, hypochlorhydria, mineral deficiencies, etc. We're going to talk a little bit more about the hypochlorhydria connection in a minute. But for me, when I am determining, we see a GI map, we get the H. pylori result. When I'm determining the clinical relevance of this result, my assessment is going to involve what are the symptoms, what is the patient experiencing. If they're experiencing kind of these upper GI dyspeptic type symptoms, then I'm going to be more inclined to treat the H. pylori. Number 2, what is their digestive capacity? We want to compare the result to the digestive markers on page 4, and we want to compare them to more overgrowth patterns or any overgrowth patterns on the GI map. If we're seeing weak digestion and a lot of overgrowth, I'm going to be more inclined to treat that H. pylori because that's going to be a clue to me that's impacting stomach acid and contributing to hypochlorhydria. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that right now. So one of the biggest themes that we educate on with the GI map and dots we connect in terms of functional GI health is this ability of H. pylori to produce this enzyme called urease, which is essentially ammonia, which can neutralize stomach acid and induce pH changes to the GI tract. And stomach acid is a really big deal and a really important part of normal GI physiology. Altering stomach acid can lead to a variety of changes, including malabsorption of macro and micronutrients, maldigestion of protein, and then dysbiosis patterns. So we're going to talk about dysbiosis here in a second, but with H. pylori, we are more inclined to see either or a blend of digestive dysfunction dysbiosis or inflammatory overgrowth dysbiosis. And again, that's largely due to this impact on stomach acid. And stomach acid is highly antimicrobial. So if we have less stomach acid, we're more prone to have overgrowth. And that's the picture we create or paint or illustrate in a lot of our education. Again, when I get an H. pylori, and there is no black and white. There is no when it's this level we treat, when it's this level we don't treat. I work with providers that treat H. pylori every time they see it on a GI map. That's their rule of thumb. Cool. There's plenty of providers out there like that. But for me, my assessment's going to include what is the result? What is the quantitative result? What are the patient's symptoms? Are there patterns of weak digestion and hypochlorhydria? And are there positive virulence factors? So I'm taking all of that into consideration when I'm going to decide to treat H. pylori or not. And I've already mentioned these next two bullets, but our lower limit of detection for H. pylori is, again, 1.0 E2 or 100. That's the lowest result you'll see. And the virulence factors and antibiotic resistance genes will only populate as a pos-neg if the result is greater than 5.0 E2, which is equivalent to 500. Okay. So hopefully I gave you a little bit of a good tidbit there on H. pylori. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about GI-MAP dysbiosis patterns. This is something that we've been educating on for several years. I've been with DSL for 3 years just last week, and we were starting this educational theme when I came here. So this has been going on in for years. I've actually noticed that a lot of our competitors in the space have adopted this theme of education as well. And now they're speaking to dysbiosis patterns. Copying is a big form of flattery, but it's pattern recognition in functional tests is what it's all about. So we have three main buckets of dysbiosis. Not every GI map you see will nice and cleanly fit into these buckets. Of course, sometimes there can be overlap, but it's a really great way of understanding this test. And so the three main patterns that we're educating on are insufficiency dysbiosis, inflammatory dysbiosis, and digestive dysfunction dysbiosis. And I'm going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail. But when you're interpreting these tests, I would really encourage you to be asking yourself, okay, does this fit? Does this test fit into one of these three patterns? Then it really makes everything easier when you start to look at it through this lens. So let's talk about insufficiency. This is like what everyone thought microbiome science was 10, 15 years ago, that everyone's gut was completely depleted. Everyone just needed probiotics. Probiotics are going to fix the world. And sometimes that is the case. So when we talk about an insufficiency dysbiosis, this is characterized by low levels of beneficial bacteria that are critically important for intestinal health and immune function. And having this insufficiency is going to create an opportunity for subsequent overgrowth and increase the risk of intestinal infections. Also, we tend to see more of a leaky gut with this insufficiency dysbiosis and a low secretory IgA. And that's going to increase the potential for driving that inflammatory overgrowth. So really, you're looking at that the commensal section, if everything is trending to the left, really low phyla counts, low butyrate producers. I'm always cross-comparing this to the secretory IgA and potentially the zonulin if we have that available as well. So this is an example of what an insufficiency dysbiosis might look like. This is what I just described. So a couple years ago, the GI map got a little bit of a facelift and we added these color bars and tick marks. And I think that makes the readability so much better. What we're looking at here, we can easily see that this is a skew towards the left or more of an insufficiency picture. Most of these commensals are trending low, including the two main phyla. I always like to compare the commensals to secretory IgA. Secretory IgA gives you an immense amount of information, really. And our immune function, our mucosal immune function, which is what secretory IgA is telling us, is largely dependent on the health of the commensals. And so weakness in the commensal microbiome is more often than not going to allude to low secretory IgA. And it lines up a very high percentage of the time when you're looking at these tests. And then this is also largely a leaky gut picture as well. So it's very common to see this pattern with a high zonulin if you are opting to add on zonulin to the test. All right. Our next bucket is inflammatory dysbiosis. All right. So this is where we see moderate to high levels of certain pathogens. Even some of our commensals, when they are trending high or frank high, can be inflammatory. And then we're really looking at and leaning on that page 3, looking at those inflammatory opportunists. Certainly, inflammation can drive leaky gut as well. That's a different mechanism of leaky gut. We can see leaky gut parameters, but largely we're looking at elevations in that proteobacteria phyla, The page 3 microorganisms, a lot of these guys are gram negative. Everything in proteobacteria is gram negative, going to be carrying that LPS, which can activate, it's an endotoxin, it can activate immune responses. These guys also produce things like histamine. A lot of them are biofilm formers. They're tricky little bugs, right? And a lot of times they do need to be addressed to reduce inflammation. You can also get insight from the commensals. A lot of the commensals are very sensitive to inflammation. So you can see low levels of commensals in addition to high levels of inflammatory opportunists. And it could just be at that point, it becomes like a chicken and the egg. Is the inflammation, is the inflammatory skew in the environment thwarting the growth of these good guys that just don't thrive well in inflammation. And a lot of times that's the case. So we have to take steps to correct the inflammatory environment in addition to manipulating the microbiota as well. So this would be an example of inflammatory dysbiosis. Obviously, this is an extremely reactive page 3. Oops, sorry. Sometimes this is one that I describe as you look at this and it makes you want to fall backwards out of your chair. It's not that this would be fairly extreme, I'll admit, but we do see things like this regularly. So this would be an example of inflammatory dysbiosis where you have a whole lot of these inflammatory LPS producing organisms elevated at, again, very high abundance. And I can't emphasize enough, something like this, you want to be looking at the order of magnitude. You want to be looking at the value to the right of the E and comparing it to the reference range. So you can see we've got 3 orders of magnitude elevated, 2 orders of magnitude elevated for a variety of these organisms. So very important for your interpretation. All right. And then our third pattern is digestive dysfunction dysbiosis. This is really common, and this is one that I hone in on all the time. And to me, it's sometimes one of the easier ones to correct. I feel like it gets missed in functional gut health a lot, again, because people are not addressing this concept of hypochlorhydria. So digestive dysfunction, by and large, is often caused by hypochlorhydria, can also be caused by insufficient bile acids, poor digestion, pancreatic insufficiency, or brush border enzyme insufficiency, reduced absorption, altered GI motility. We will often see a digestive dysfunction dysbiosis in chronic constipation guts. You get good at looking at these patterns. I can potentially predict, like when I see these tests, if a patient is experiencing constipation or diarrhea, a lot of times based on the patterns. This is going to be characterized by certainly we often see overgrowth with digestive dysfunction. It may not be the inflammatory overgrowth. We may see overgrowth of the commensals. We may see overgrowth of things like staph and strep. That's very common on page 3. We may see the Methanobacteriaceae elevated in this sort of condition. And we tend to see symptoms of gas and bloating, which I'm sure you all know is like the most common symptom set that patients often come in with. Dyspepsia, heartburn, GERD, constipation, diarrhea, food sensitivities, intolerances. That's a lot of symptoms. But digestion is important. If you're not digesting properly, it's going to set the stage for a whole gamut of functional health, gut health issues. All right. So this would be an example of what we're looking at. So we really want to hone in on those digestive markers on page 4. We look at steatocrit, which is a reflection of fat in stool. That's less common to see out of range unless there's malabsorptive issues. But we're really looking at that pancreatic elastase 1. This result of 93 would be considered extremely low. We educate that we want to see elastase over 500 from a functional perspective. That's really what the literature suggests is optimal for pancreatic output. And this is assessing the output of pancreatic enzymes. So the pancreatic enzyme MELU of digestive enzymes, amylase, proteases, lipases. Conventional medicine calls this low under 200, and that's where our reference range is set. I can't tell you how many times I get a consult on the phone and the providers, look, this patient has had extensive GI workup. They've been to 15 doctors. Nothing's wrong with them. All the tests come back clean and they'll have an elastase under 200 on the GI map. And I'll say, has this ever been looked at before? And the answer is no. And To me, that blows my mind because it's a very simple, requires a stool test, but very simple, very well recognized biomarker that just doesn't get assessed enough. So always looking at that against H. pylori, always looking at that against the rest of the patterns on the GI map. It gives you a huge amount of insight. So obviously we're looking at H. pylori due to everything we just talked about with H. pylori's potential impact on hypochlorhydria. We always want to compare that to the digestive markers. And then overgrowth patterns, particularly those pH sensitive organisms, high phyla. We'll often see yeast overgrowth. Yeast is a very slow growing organism. So we tend to see more yeast overgrowth in this sort of pattern of digestive insufficiency and often slow motility as well. So that would be an example. And the phyla overgrowth is a good clue as well. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly go through some of our available resources, and then I guess we'll open it up to Q&A. So our GI Map Interpretive Guide, if you don't have this, please download it. It's available. We can even probably put a link in the chat here, but you can Google GI Map Interpretive Guide, or you can access it from our GI Map webpage or through our resource library that you get through the DSL website. I'll talk about that in a second. So if you don't have this, please download it. I asked people on my consults if they have it. A lot of times they don't. It's a really nice desk reference. It's not going to have every answer to every one of your questions, but it's a very good place to start. And in the back of the interpretive guide, we have patterns. So we have little tip sheets talking about these dysbiosis patterns. We also have tables that demonstrate like gas and histamine producers on the GI map and patterns that you would see in barrier permeability. We also have a white paper available to download. That's more of a technical document. It's 300 and something pages. It's not something that you're going to want to read, start to finish, but it's very well referenced. And if you're ever looking to like more nerd out on some of the specific targets on the test, that is available. And then we also have our DSL Academy that is available to DSL account holders. This is newer. This is our learning platform. We do have now 3 courses specific for the GI Map. We have a GI Map Essentials course, an H. pylori Masterclass series, and we just launched a dysbiosis patterns course actually this week. That's something that I've had this has been a lot of my baby that I've been working on for the past several years, and we're pretty proud of it. It's like almost like the GI Map Essentials course is almost like an interp guide come to life. And then we also have our resource library, which is open to the public, available to everyone. You can access that from the DSL website. And there we actually updated it earlier this year. It's now fully searchable. So you can search by test, you can search by topic, you can search by symptom. If you're like histamine or bloating, you can pull up any of our resources that pertain to that topic. So good stuff.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.